Okay, so welcome back to the Millennial Harbinger podcast and YouTube channel. Um, we are pushing forward in our discussion on where we see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play within Romans 1:18 through 2:11, which I was put on to that observation by Michael Heiser in his book, The Unseen Realm, where he says, hey, this is where you see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that he talks about in his book the most in the New Testament. And I was like, what? That was an aha moment. And I think it's a means to try to reenchant and have better conversations in our churches about the important subject of same-sex sexual relationships, homosexuality, etc. Because in the words of Charles Taylor, I think, we are disenchanted. And as a result, we have a hard time understanding and really thinking and reading the Bible the way an ancient Jew, ancient Hebrew, a first century Jew, first century Jewish Christian would. And so we need some help. And I think Heiser does help us a lot in terms of re-enchanting us, especially how we read Romans 1:18 through 2:11 and understand what Paul's getting at here. And so in this episode 6, I want to finish going through the section where I'm trying to identify spots within Romans 1:18 through 2:11 where I see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview perhaps at play, unpacking Heiser's observation that he did not unpack himself anywhere that I've found. And so here we go. Let's do it. Let's finish off this section and see what happens. All right. So I want to pick back up and talking about this term paradidomy. The term paradidomy alone is itself theologically significant and revealing of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Okay? It appears almost 200 times in the Septuagint, with 100 uses in the Torah and Deuteronomistic, hard to say that, Deuteronomistic history. One of its 22 uses in Deuteronomy 32:30 Septuagint, mentions the Lord handed them over. Kyrios paradoken autus. Okay? And is similar to the parsing and grammatical structure of the clause Paul uses 3 times in the passage. God handed them over in Romans 1:24, 26, and 28. So this term and similar phrasing and parsing can be found in many other significant passages. For example, Psalm 105:41 Septuagint says, he handed them over into the hands of the nations. Second, Jeremiah 2:24 Septuagint compares idolatrous Israel to a lustful and uncontrollable wild donkey in heat, whom the gods will easily find and receive worship from. Third, in the divine counsel scene of Job 2:6 Septuagint, God hands Job over into the hands of the Satan, who then takes Job's health away through a disease. And then fourth, there's 2 parts here. Fourth, in Psalm 77 Septuagint, it discusses how God handed the Egyptians over to, get this, destroying angels, right? Verses 42 through 53, in recounting the 10 plagues against Egypt, it says God handed them over to destroying angels. The angels brought upon each of the plagues, which is kind of makes sense when after reading Revelation 10, how the angels bring the plagues too. But in Psalm 77 Septuagint as well, you have God handing over his power and glory to the nations and subsequently their gods when they took Israel into exile due to Israel's idolatry in verses 54 through 64. Interesting how God says, I handed over my power and glory to the nations and thus their gods, when Israel committed idolatry and I had to send them into exile as their covenant consequence for idolatry. Okay, so this term paradidomy, it's really, really interesting in and of itself, really cool, really theologically significant. Another significant passage where paradidomy is found is Melchizedek's blessing of Abram after rescuing Lot in Genesis 14:17 through 24. Now, this is the first place the term is found in the Septuagint, which is always kind of significant to kind of go back and like, okay, where is this term found for the first time? Where's that term found for the first time? And for paradidomy, it's the Melchizedek story in Genesis 14. Interesting. It is also important to note that this is the first conflict and victory of God and his nation, Abram, over and against the nations and their gods after Babel. Okay, noted. Melchizedek prays, quote, "And blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies into your hand." Verse 20. Additionally, God is referred to as Most High 4 times in this passage, a title found only a total of 6 times in the Torah, Deuteronomy 32:8, Numbers 24:16, and factors heavily in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview texts that we've looked at already. Deuteronomy 32:8, Psalm 82:6, Psalm 78:17, 35, and 56, which is Psalm 77 Septuagint. Okay, Melchizedek also calls God the possessor of heaven and earth in verses 19 to 22, which is another parallel with Deuteronomy 32. Finally, the term blessed, eulogeo, in verses 19 and 20, also find that in Romans 1:20, Romans 1:25, references its earlier use in Genesis 1 through 11. You find it in Genesis 1:22-28, 2:3, 5:2, 9:1. As Abram and his descendants now are the ones whom Yahweh will give a great name, as opposed to the giants and their descendants. Okay, so here's something else. This brief analysis of paradidomy peers into what possibly lies behind Paul's words in Romans 1:18 through 2:11. Beyond just merely being handed over into greater sinfulness of mind and behavior emphasizing homosexual activity, perhaps Paul is also implying whose hands they were handed over into that negatively influenced them into that greater sinfulness, i.e., the rebel Elohim, or powers and principalities. Now, in Douglas Moo's commentary, NIV application commentary on Romans, he states a common thought expressed in modern Romans commentaries who are not familiar with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. There he says, in light of this idea of being handed over, just who the people are who make these exchanges is never clearly stated. What Paul means by this exchanging and handed over language is unclear. Okay. So there Moo admits, I don't know, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what Paul means here. And here's where Heiser says that, his observation that modern Romans commentaries are irrelevant because they're not taking this Deuteronomy 32 worldview and all that's involved in it into account in understanding and reading Romans 1. Okay? The scholar Beverly Roberts Gaventa, in her book, Our Mother St. Paul, demonstrates that handing over virtually always involves a handing over to another agent. Okay? Is this an example of a lack of specific mention because Paul's readers would have understood his implication? Rhetorical question. I think so. I think this is an example of Paul not spelling things out because he's not talking to us. He's talking to first century Jews and Gentiles, first century Jewish Christians who would have gotten it without him spelling it out. All right. Paul's other letters, let's turn the page. Paul's other letters could bear witness to this implication when he commands the church in Corinth to hand over the man who has taken his father's wife, hand him over to Satan, 1 Corinthians 5:5. And where Paul says he hands Hymenaeus and Alexander over to Satan himself due to blasphemy in 1 Timothy 1:20. I think that implication that's unstated by Paul in Romans 1, I think we can imply that they're being handed over to the rebel Elohim, to the powers and principalities, like in the story in Genesis 11 at Babel. Okay? The term's use, paradidomy that is, in the Gospels over 80 times in reference to Jesus being handed over to his death could also bear witness to this implication. Now, it's used over 80 times in the Gospels. Here are several examples of where it's used in reference to Jesus being handed over to his death. Okay, there's an example in Matthew 10, verse 4, where Judas betraying Jesus, Judas hands Jesus over. Then you have in Matthew 26:2 and Luke 9:44, Jesus' teaching of his mission as the Son of Man, is the purpose of it is to be handed over. And then the resurrected Jesus in Luke 24, verse 7, I think he's talking to the two men on the road to Emmaus, where he's like, hey, didn't you know this? I had to be handed over to be crucified based upon your scriptures. So those are three examples of Jesus using that very term being used of Jesus being handed over to his death in the Gospels. The Son of God was handed over to Rome, who performed the execution, but at the same time, the hands of the rebel sons of God were the ones who ultimately instigated his death. Heiser talks about that in The Unseen Realm in pages 288 to 295. Heiser also talks about Psalm 22, which Jesus quotes on the cross, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? Verse 1 of that psalm. And when you quote the first verse of a psalm or first passage of a text in that culture, everybody understood you had the whole thing in mind. And so one of the things mentioned in Psalm 22 is that idea of the bulls of Bashan surrounding and encompassing him. And the bulls of Bashan is one of those terms, beastly and animal terms used to refer to evil spiritual beings. But Peter himself references, quote, the angels or sons of God who sinned in Genesis 6 as being handed over to their punishment and demise in Tartarus by God in 2 Peter 2:20 and 2 Peter 2:4. These same quote unquote spirits in prison, Jesus descended into the underworld to victoriously and ironically confront upon his death on the cross as the second Enoch, according to Peter as well. 1 Peter 3:14 through 22, declaring all rebel sons of God as ultimately defeated. And Heiser goes into that as well in many places, such as the Unseen Realm. In this line of thought, guys, perhaps one could say that after all humanity had been handed over into the hands of rebel spiritual beings at Babel, or just after all of humanity had been handed over into the hands of the spiritual beings at Babel, Jesus handed himself over into their hands, their same hands, in order to free humanity and all creation from that spiritual bondage and related kia. I think that makes sense to me. Jesus handed himself over to defeat those whom humanity had been handed over, so that they could experience that spiritual freedom from slavery, spiritual bondage. Yeah, the more I think about that, the more they're like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and so that's the end of my section where I go into possibly how we see the spots where we see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play within Romans 1:18 through 2:11. A lot more can be done, right? And I begin the next section where I then kind of make some observations and conclusions. That next section is titled The Deuteronomy 32 Worldview and Same-Sex Sexual Relationships, where I start off saying this. Based upon the above analysis, which is notably still in process, what does this possibly mean for understanding same-sex sexual activity within the meta-narrative of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview? To put it succinctly, in light of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview present within Romans 1:18 through 2:11, same-sex sexual activity is a highlighted aspect and consequence of Israel's idolatry. Having been handed over into the hands of the rebel sons of God at Babel due to idolatry, humanity was led deeper and further into that idolatry and the resulting and worsening adakia that includes a litany of sins, along with same-sex sexual activity. The common occurrence of pairing idolatry and homosexuality in Hellenistic Judaism in works like the Wisdom of Solomon finds its origin within this meta-narrative, beginning with the three human and divine transgressions of Genesis 1 through 11, the prologue of Scripture. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, paralleling the sins of the Watchers in Genesis 6 and its consequences, is the first iteration of the city of Babylon post-Genesis 11. It's kind of like the flood in the Abraham narrative. Let's see. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah highlights sexual sin, angels in human male form, and the men of the city serving as somewhat of a signal of the extensive adikia present within. It wasn't the only sin, but that's the one that's being highlighted. That's the one comparing what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah to what was happening in the pre-flood world that led God to bring about the flood. For Paul, Rome could have served as the most apparent and latest iteration of the city of Babylon of his day, which may just be why he chose these particular words to words to write to the church in Romans 1:18 through 2:11. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit further into this third section and see what happens. So let me say this: more could be said, and more needs to be said, and trying to elucidate how Deuteronomy 32, that worldview, can help us read Romans 1:18 through 2:11. But if this take is accurate, guys, then at this moment a problem needs to be addressed. And Heiser mentions this problem many different times. That problem is the complete absence of this Deuteronomy 32 worldview meta-narrative and argumentation when it comes to non-affirming arguments and affirming arguments about the homosexual lifestyle in Christians in Romans 1:18 through 2:11. Another way to word that is like the problem of our disenchantedness and how that affects our reading of Scripture and thus our theology, particularly on the subject of same-sex sexual relationships, homosexuality, etc. Especially narrowing it down even more, arguments either for or against the notion that Scripture does not prohibit loving, consensual, monogamous, committed, lifelong same-sex relationships and marriages. Okay? For example, non-affirming published life story treatises do not do much more than simply mention Romans 1:18 through 2:11 as a reason why those like Caleb Kaltenbach or Beckett Cook, turn the page, decided to be non-affirming and or stop practicing a homosexual lifestyle. Okay, so they mention it as reasoning why, but they don't really dive into it, especially dive into it in light of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Sam Allberry's booklet devotes very little space to the Romans passage and is absent, is void of the Deuteronomy 32 backstory, foundation for understanding Romans 1 through 18 through 2:11. Andrew Marin, in his book, draws his oneness principle from this passage, yet does not base his interpretive conclusions from this spiritual warfare perspective. Preston Sprinkle has one of the better popular level non-affirming treatments, yet simply goes kind of the creation and Genesis 1-2 route of like how we're created in terms of like there's male and there's female anatomy. So the argument like from design, he goes that route without mentioning Psalm 105, Deuteronomy 4, etc., without mentioning the Deuteronomy 32 stuff. Fortson and Grams give an excellent academic and historical analysis. They do not include historical argumentation based upon what Heiser calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, nor argue based on it themselves. And finally, Heiser considers Robert Gagnon's book the best treatment on the subject of homosexuality, and I think I heard him say that in one or two of his podcasts on the Naked Bible podcasts. But one only detects notes and not a full picture of what Heiser calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview within his line of thought there in Gagnon's book. Gagnon's book is Homosexuality and the Bible. Let me see if I can get the full title. The Bible and Homosexual Practice, Texts and Hermeneutics. So Robert A.J. Gagnon. If you're interested in learning more, reading more about the subject of the Bible and homosexuality, I would get Robert Gagnon's book. Heiser said it's the best one in his opinion. Let me also say this. Recent popular and academic works affirming monogamous and committed same-sex relationships are also missing in the Deuteronomy 32, missing the Deuteronomy 32 perspective in the reading of Romans 1:18 through 2:11. That could be Colby Martin's book on Clobbered, Okay, that could be Justin Lee's Torn. That could be Brownson's Bible, Gender, and Sexuality. That could be Jack Rogers' Jesus, the Bible, and Homosexuality. That could be Matthew Vines's God and the Gay Christian. Okay, I think you could pretty much say all of them lack the Deuteronomy 32 worldview perspective or arguing for or against it. Right? They just don't. They don't have it in there. It's not in there. One I'm going to highlight is Karen Keene's book called Scripture, Ethics, and the Possibility of Same-Sex Relationships. Obviously, Karen Keene married Sally Gary back at the end of 2020 after they announced at the Centerpiece Conference that they were pretty much going to be affirming, that Sally Gary was affirming that she was going to marry Karen Keene, and the Centerpiece organization was going to serve churches from an affirming perspective that point forward, and they weren't going to be, I guess, silent about that anymore. And so I highlight Keene's book here with that Church of Christ background myself. So Karen Keene summarizes her take on the top 4 non-affirming arguments, as well as her take on the top 5 corresponding affirming arguments in her book. The third and fourth affirming arguments pertain to Romans 1, which are Paul's use of unnatural must be understood in his historical context, and Romans 1 does not describe most gay and lesbian people. These are responses to the non-affirming third argument incorporating Romans 1, where she summarizes that as same-sex desire is a result of the fall. Keene's fourth affirming argument is a rewording of Vines's excessive lust reading, which Preston Sprinkle considers the best affirming argument. And he wrote an article called Paul and Homosexual Behavior, a critical evaluation of the excessive lust interpretation of Romans 1, 26 through 27 in the Bulletin for Biblical Research. So read that article if you want a non-affirming response to that excessive lust argument, affirming argument. But again, none of these summarized arguments involve the Deuteronomy 32 supernatural perspective. It is just also simply interesting to note that there is no mention of the Satan, of Satan, or spiritual beings, or spiritual evil at all in the in these summations of affirming, non-affirming arguments, or in Keene's very own argument. It seems like a general observation is therefore her argument and her summations of these arguments on both sides is somewhat disenchanted. I know I'm probably throwing that around too much, but it's a possibility. And so what follows in the rest of my paper are 10 modest observations. I try to be modest. I try to be humble in my paper and as in life. But they're observations based upon the Deuteronomy 32 worldview within Romans 1:18 through 2:11, being a means of reenchanting the same-sex sexual relationship conversation between affirming and non-affirming Christians within churches in the age of authenticity. Okay, that was a mouthful. So let's try to run through these 10 real quick to finish off this episode. Number 1, there is in a sense a pox on both houses, affirming and non-affirming, where Heiser's new research on the Deuteronomy 32 worldview has revealed a certain degree of biblical illiteracy on both stances' argumentations. Both sides accuse the other of not seeing the forest for the trees, right? It's a fun phrase to throw around if you in an argument with somebody. Both sides accuse the other of not seeing the forest for the trees, but Heiser's spiritual warfare perspective may necessitate reassessing all current takes on Romans 1. The Deuteronomy 32 worldview take on Romans 1:18 through 2:11 does more than just simply, quote unquote, rehash the same unhelpful arguments based on what Keene calls this proof text. I think that reading Romans 1:18 through 2:11 within the reenchanting lens of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview shows us that that passage is not just simply a proof text read out of context in order to say homosexuality or same-sex sexual relationships are wrong. I think it creates, it reveals that a non-affirming reading of it is what's intended by Paul. Rather, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview could be a paradigm shifting for the doubting and disenchanted and bring a healthy dose of humility into the conversation. I think it could bring humility into the conversation because it's like, oh, wait, whoa, we're actually not reading it the way we should. Both sides. Uh-oh. That's a hope. Will it happen? Number 2, second observation. Because of the absence of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview perspective in the current literature and conversation surrounding Romans 1, 18 through 2:11, new popular and academic resources must be created? I think so. I almost went this route for my Demon Final project, but I chose to go a different route. But these resources need to help ministers and congregations wrestle with and assist in the dialogue, regardless whether the particular take in this paper is actually accurate or not. But whatever this take is in this paper and what I'm communicating from it, it definitely needs to be, more needs to be done with it. Third, the current state of the conversation is one which is disenchanted. Disenchanted Christians trying to incorporate the enchanted Deuteronomy 32 worldview into an already volatile topic will be very challenging. But as Cosper recommends, quote, we must acknowledge our disenchantment and realize we did it to ourselves. In Romans 1:18 through 2:11, I add. This involves realizing our de-angelification and trying to learn how to think in the supernatural categories of an ancient Hebrew. Not easy. However, this will not be a silver bullet to resolve the debate within churches, as there will be those who find Heiser's proposal, this argument, this offshoot, unconvincing, and needles won't move in either direction, right? Either non-affirming or affirming. People will just remain planted where they're at. But I'm kind of tired of seeing Christians moving in an affirming direction just because of where I'm at with my understanding right now. I think that is a problem based off of, again, the historical, traditional Judeo-Christian sexual ethic. Again, another thing that needs to be talked about is how the historical understanding of the church and of Jews is bypassed or ignored or argued against as not really proof of a non-affirming stance. But that's for another episode. My fourth observation. The Deuteronomy 32 worldview reading of Romans 1:18 through 2:11 leans not affirming on the homosexual lifestyle in general and monogamous and committed same-sex sexual relationships in particular. Keene is correct to note that, quote, both sides agree that the Bible authors oppose same-sex relations in part for exploitative reasons. But the Deuteronomy 32 perspective expands the reasons more broadly to the point of disagreement. And that disagreement is this. Fifth, this expansion is due to the Enochian teleology of evil, which offers a supernatural nuance to the disagreement centering on gender and anatomical complementarity, like the one Preston Sprinkle argues, between the affirming and non-affirming stances. The Deuteronomy 32 worldview blames the watchers of Genesis 6 and their breaking of heavenly and earthly boundaries as background for understanding the severity of homosexual sin as outlined in the Mosaic Law. Churches will need to expand their own understanding of sin beyond an Adam-centric explanation that includes the powers, principalities, watchers, rebel sons of God, daimonion, etc. That's a hard thing to do, but it needs to be done. Okay, so there are the first 5 observations, and I'm going to cut this episode off now because we're getting to around that 30-minute mark. And so, guys, hey, thanks for sticking with me through this episode. In the next episode, I'll finish the paper, make a couple observations, and think through like, okay, where do we need to go moving forward in terms of having this conversation, using this paper as launching us further and beyond, to seeing how the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that Heiser has gifted us with realizing and seeing in Scripture can help reenchant us and reenchant our reading of Romans 1 and the conversation in our churches about same-sex sexual relationships and homosexuality. So until next episode, we will see you later. Out of here. This is Jordan Koss signing off. Bye.